Hello and welcome. Hope you all had a fun spring break. This week we will begin with Hume, David Hume, and the first section of the reading is very small. For Hume is merely just contrasting his two different philosophies and basically lays out his philosophical project, which focuses on the nature of human understanding. If you didn't already get that from the title of the book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He actually wrote this book to clarify or refine his ideas expressed in an earlier book that he wrote called The Treatise of Human Nature, which to Hume's surprise received very little attention. This book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, builds upon empirical philosophy. Empirical philosophy is the belief that knowledge is acquired through sense data. And obviously, this is vastly different than the philosopher we just left, René Descartes. René Descartes was an extreme rationalist. He believed knowledge is had by using one's reason, and sensory experience merely gets in the way. So Hume is an avid, or many consider him a radical empiricist. I'll get a little bit into that later. But he is building upon the philosophy of John Locke, a 17th century British empiricist, and building upon George Berkeley, or Bishop Berkeley as he's known throughout the philosophical community. And Hume builds upon these two empiricists while attacking the metaphysical rationalism of specifically Descartes and other rationalists of that time. So when he says metaphysical rationalism, the metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that really focuses on first principles, these things that occur as the foundation of concepts of being and knowing, or substances, the cause of space and time, things that happen before space and time. But for Descartes, his metaphysics came into play with God. If you remember, he only got certainty or acquired certainty of the outside world because God wasn't a deceiver. So that's kind of the foreground of his understanding on why he can perceive the outside world. So that's what metaphysics is. And the metaphysical rationalism is he takes the metaphysical concept of God's creation and him not being a deceiver as the forefront for him to use his mind to understand the world. So he's using rational thought in order to acquire knowledge. The Hume is against this, and we'll get into just how much against this he is, as he is considered the radical empiricist. But philosophy since Descartes has been marked by a rough distinction between empiricist and rationalist philosophy. Rationalists tend to concern themselves with metaphysical questions of the nature of substance, of God, of soul, of matter, and so on, and usually tied these answers and these questions through the exercise of pure reason. So one uses their reason to figure out the world with an underlying concept of the substance of God. That was Descartes all over. On the other hand, empiricists were more interested in epistemology, and epistemology is the study of knowledge. And so they were interested in epistemology and determining precisely what and how we can know, arguing that experience is the only sure guide to substantial knowledge about the world. That's right. Empiricist doctrine is that experience is the only sure guide to substantial knowledge about the world. Some may ask, according to Descartes, how do we even know an outside world exists? Well, empiricists like Hume, are considered important figures in what's called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment period is a time where philosophers were running into roadblocks and they just said, you know what, there is an outside world and we have the capabilities of understanding it. That's what the Enlightenment period is. And that's why I chose Hume to come before Searle, because Searle and the modern philosophers of this time really all take the Enlightenment period and the concept of we have the ability to understand the outside world, and there is an existing outside world. They take this for granted. Like, this is what we are all going to agree upon, and now we're going to move on from that. That is what is meant by the Enlightenment period, or the period of enlightenment. So Hume is considered an important figure in the Enlightenment because he's a radical empiricist who believes that knowledge can only be acquired through experience. And the Enlightenment represents a climate of intellectual optimism regarding the capabilities of human reason. This optimism is we can understand the outside world. Intellectually, there is an outside world for us to comprehend. We just need to be careful on how we reason. But Hume's empiricism is just unflinchingly followed to its logical conclusion. It's like he knows we can only have knowledge through sensory experience, and he takes that beginning foundation and just unflinchingly follows it to its logical conclusions. If our only guide to worldly knowledge comes from experience, then there is very little we can safely claim to know. Perhaps the most significant effect of his skepticism expressed in this inquiry is the impact it had upon another famous philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who is an avid rationalist. Kant famously remarked, after reading Hume, that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber and prompted him to write The Critique of Pure Reason, which stands as one of the most significant works of philosophy ever written. So Hume's impact, his empiricism, woke Kant from a dogmatic slumber because Kant realized that rationalists took many things for granted. And in the Inquiry of Human Understanding, we're really going to delve into Hume's arguments and see how the rationalists have been taking things for granted. It's quite phenomenal. I have a lot of fun reading Hume because even in Hume's time, people saw him as just a destroyer of arguments. The way he brought stuff in, and he would come to seminars and explain certain things, although he was never a professor because the philosophers of his time really didn't like him. They equated him as being one who just likes to shock and awe. But regardless, the arguments that he made against rationalism for empiricism are just monumental, and we're definitely going to go over many of them during these next 4 weeks. And with that, we'll move on to the first part in Section 1, where Hume outlines two different moral philosophies. So Section 1 begins with Hume talking about moral philosophy. And when he says moral philosophy here, he means all subjects that have a relation to human nature. I know this can get kind of confusing because even later on in the section, he talks about moralists, and he talks about moralists in the light of ethics. In this particular instance, though, when he says moral philosophy, he is just talking about all the subjects that have a relation to human nature. So whether what we feel, what we understand, what we like, what we dislike, what pains us, what ails us, things of that nature is what he is referring to. And he splits philosophy, as a philosophy that has been done up to this point, into two distinct approaches. One he calls the easy and obvious philosophy, and the other one is the accurate and abstruse. The first, moral philosophy, and again, moral as a relation to human nature, the easy and obvious, focuses on man as chiefly born for action and as influenced in his measures by taste and sentiment, pursuing one object and avoiding another. What he means by this is, in this first philosophy, it's the most easy and obvious because we learn to stay away from fire because it burns me. We learn that water is good for us because it sustains us. We learn the taste of an apple is good versus the sourness of a meat that is bad. They make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. They excite and regulate our sentiment. Our sentiment is our senses, our experience. And even Descartes admitted this. Remember when he was talking about how he could come to know the thinking thing, and he was having problems with this because his body just makes him know that these things are out there, and yet he has such a problem with understanding the thinking thing. Hume is talking about the easy and the obvious make us feel the difference. I don't need to think about the fire burning me. This difference is just known so vividly that it regulates my senses to stay away from fire. The easy and obvious are usually written poetically, to make us feel the difference between vice and virtue. And now he's specifically talking about those philosophers that really focused on exciting the sentiment. And he gives a list of them. One is Cicero, one is La Bruyere, and the other is Addison. And he associates these philosophers with providing philosophy the easy and obvious option. Their philosophy is fun to read. Their philosophy is almost poetic. Their philosophy is made to excite the sentiment. So the easy and obvious philosophy is quite popular and keeps good standing in posterity, and it always follows from common sense, thus rarely falls into error, according to Hume. Now, I've never read Cicero or La Bruyere or Addison, but I do know specifically what he's talking about here, because in Eastern philosophy, they focus on the philosophy of action just as much as they focus on the philosophy of reason. And one of the arguments for the universality of benevolence as being a respect for fellow man, a caring for fellow man, is Mungza. And he states, picture a little girl dancing around a well, and you're watching her and she's having fun, and then boom, she slips in and she falls. You will feel this rush of anxiety. You will feel this rush of sentiment. And he goes even further to state that if you had a crowd around you and the girl went to fall in the well, everyone would have that same sentiment, would have that same feeling rush to them. And that proves that benevolence or human care is a universal feeling. And while there are many side arguments and counterexamples to this that he also meets and argues against, it's not an Eastern philosophy course, so we won't really get into that. But if you can understand that the philosophy itself that he's putting forward is meant to excite your sentiment, while the story is being told, you yourself feel that rush. Even if it's just a fairly minimum amount, you feel it in your gut. And that shows that benevolence is universal, and it brings his theory or argument or philosophical argument into light. This is what Hume is specifically talking about for the easy and obvious philosophers. So that's what this first philosophy, the easy and obvious, is considered. That which excites the sentiment. The way we learn through trial and error, the way we learn through sensory experience. That is what he means by this first philosophy. And with that, we'll move into the second philosophy. The second moral philosophy is what he calls the accurate and abstruse philosophy. So the accurate and abstruse considers man in the light of the reasonable rather than an active being, and endeavors to form his understanding more than cultivate his manners. They focus more on philosophical inquiry and philosophical thought to figure out life rather than going out and experiencing life. They regard human nature as a subject of speculation, and with a narrow scrutiny examines it in order to find those principles which regulate our understanding. For example, Socrates once criticized a carpenter for merely copying the form of a chair. And this is what Hume is talking about. You know, the human nature to build something is regarded by rationalists in the eye of speculation. Are they really building a chair? Can you describe to me what a chair is? You know, a chair has 4 legs. Well, see, not all things that have 4 legs are chairs. Oh, well, a chair is a thing you sit on. Well, what if I sit on a table? Is it then a chair? You know, they regard human nature, human interaction as a subject of speculation. When somebody falls in love, is that really love? If a person looks beautiful, as we discussed in the Phaedo, are they really beautiful? So this is that narrow scrutiny that Hume talks about when the accurate and abstruse philosopher examines the human nature with scrutiny in order to find the principles that regulate the understanding. The principle is specifically the Platonic form, and that is exactly what he's talking about here. They proceed until they arrive at an original principle by which every science and all human curiosity must be bounded. Here again is the Platonic form. You know, Socrates was seeking out that which is the necessary. You know, what is justice? What is impiety? And he wanted to find this essential position that by which he could equate every other aspect that we see in the world to this one form. So rather than relying upon common sense, which tells you to go out there and meet all these specific instances of piety in order to gain an understanding, this philosophy, which Hume associates with figures such as Aristotle, Malebranche, and Locke, even though Locke is an empiricist, he still tried to find an original position within ideas of justice. And that's why Locke's ideas became the foundation of the Founding Fathers' Declaration of Independence, actually. But regardless, this kind of philosophy has little application once one leaves off philosophical contemplation, because its reasoning and its conclusions often go against common sense. The error in this field is not all uncommon, and as a result, it fares rather poorly in posterity, and is sometimes rejected altogether. What he's saying here is it goes against common sense in where we believe we can rationalize the idea of beauty without going out and seeking that which is beautiful. We can rationalize the objective ideas found in art without going to the Louvre. And this goes against common sense, because even as I'm explaining this to you, you're like, well, how do you even know what beautiful is unless you go out into the world and seek that which is beautiful? How do you even know what is objectively considered art if you don't view art? And this is really what Hume is saying here. You know, this moral philosophy, the accurate and abstruse, looks to find a general principle. an underlying natural association or essential association found in all things. Now, he might sound like he is building up to completely negate the accurate and abstruse, but he's not. What he's doing here is he's laying out two different kinds of philosophy, one that focuses on the sentiment and one that focuses on general position or trying to find original essence, foundational essence, and things of that nature. Next, he's really going to go into why the easy and obvious is preferred, but there is a use for the accurate and abstruse, and we'll get into that later on in the slide. Why the easy and obvious is preferred by many. Hume starts by saying, 1, it's more useful. It enters into the common life, molding the heart and affections. Since the easy and obvious focuses on one's sentiment, it's easier for people to understand, or a more widespread demographic to understand, and it enters more into their common life. Not everyone has the philosophical stamina to sit there and contemplate things. Not everyone has the rationalism of a Descartes to lock himself away and scrutinize everything he's always believed under a skeptical microscope. You know, the common person is out there in the world learning through trial and error. And that's why the easiest and obvious philosophy is more preferred in this particular instance as it enters into common life, molding the heart and affections. 2, it reforms conduct, bringing them nearer to perfection, the perfection that the easy and obvious describes. You know, Shaolin monks are not sitting here thinking about hitting a bag until their hands can pierce rock. They're not sitting here thinking about standing on their heads until the entire body weight can be supported on their head. No, they're out there and they are striving towards the perfection they seek through action. In Hinduism, people are born with stockpiles of karma, and this karma is negative, in which you are reborn or reincarnated as a lower being if you built up a lot of karma. So they need to practice meditating, they need to practice certain types of yoga in order to bring down this karma. You know, this is a specific philosophy that focuses on the sentiment of action. Other philosophers like John Sartre, for example, is an existentialist. He believes in making a decision, that while you can contemplate over and over, it is the act of making a decision that forms your identity. You are a father because you went out there and fathered a child. You are a millionaire if you went out in the world and you gained $1 million. The action creates your identity. These types of philosophy looks to reform conduct through action, through sentiment, and through trial and error. As compared to the abstruse philosophy, the abstruse is founded on the turn of the mind, where it cannot enter into business and actions. What he's saying here is the rationalists are not concerned with actions. The rationalists are actually barely concerned with the outside world. No, they believe knowledge can be acquired by my contemplation, by rational argumentation, by using deductive arguments to arrive at deductive conclusions. But for Hume, this type of philosophy vanishes as soon as a philosopher leaves the shade, comes into the day, nor can its principles easily retain an influence over conduct and behavior. Imagine Descartes, who doesn't believe the outside world can be known for certain, but he still taught Princess Elizabeth about the passions of the soul. He still was a tutor for Queen Christine of Sweden, even though he ended up dying from pneumonia. He was still a man. He still went out into the world and was a man of action, a tutor for a queen. So all his philosophical contemplation, if the world exists or if I can know the world, was completely negated as soon as he left the shade, because he left the shade and he entered the real world. And over here, this is where Hume kind of brings to light the first jab at abstruse philosophy, is that it is easy for a profound philosophy to commit a mistake and its subtle reasoning. And then one mistake is the necessary parent of another after he pushes to his conclusions. Because later on in the sections, he delivers a strong blow to rationalist philosophy in its foundational reasoning. And then all the other conclusions that the rationalists make are now a mistake because of this foundation. And that's going to be much later on. I'm not going to explain that now. But Hume goes on to state that man is a sociable animal no less than he's a reasonable animal. And that's quite intuitive, because Descartes was saying, what am I? I'm nothing more than a thinking thing. And Plato's like, the unexamined life is just not worth living. But an argument could be made that man is just as sociable as they are a reasonable being. We need conversation. We are built to live in a community. We are built to communicate with another individual. So Hume states, be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man or be still an individual. You can philosophically contemplate, but at the end of the day, still be a person, still get out there in the world. And with that, we'll move on to what the philosophy of the abstruse can do, because in here he gives another subtle jab to what he's eventually going to say in the sections. But it's important to know that he does believe the easy and obvious is more useful in its ability to mold human conduct. So it should not be abandoned like it is for the abstruse philosopher. And then he'll get into why or what the abstruse can do and where the abstruse philosophy is beneficial. So we'll move on to what philosophy can do. What the abstruse philosophy can do. Because Hume knows that contemplation and reasoning, they do have a place in the philosophical world, obviously. He states, it's improper to allow every man to enjoy without opposition his own taste and sentiment. And this directly comes from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan in the late 1640s. Thomas Hobbes wrote this book entitled The Leviathan, which stated that in the beginning, man's world was a state of nature. The state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short-lived. So in this time, it was dog eat dog, and human life was horrid. So the humans gathered together, and they came to the conclusion that they're going to forego certain rights, like the right for me to take whatever I can take, and they're going to form a social compact, And through this social compact, they're going to all agree to live civilized and not just go over there and take whatever they want or whatever they feel they need at that particular point in time. So obviously, not every person should enjoy without opposition their own tastes and sentiment. Because then it would fall into a state of nature again. It would fall into this world of dog eat dog. If I'm hungry and you have something that I want and I'm stronger than you, well then guess what? I'm going to go over there and take it, and there's nothing you can say about it. While there is some room for what philosophy can do, because in our ability to reason and understand things, to build a social compact like in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, Hume specifically points out the key or the beginning to what is going to be a demolishing argument to rationalism later on, in that one considerable advantage is its subservience to the easy and humane, which without the former can never attain a sufficient degree of exactness in its sentiment, precepts, or reasoning. He is specifically saying that the abstruse philosophy has a subservience to the easy and humane. Now, without the easy and humane, without the ability of sentiment, you will not have the ability to reason to a specific degree. And he gives some examples of this. He starts with, all polite letters are nothing but pictures or human life in various attitudes and situations, and inspire use with different sentiment or praise or blame, admiration or ridicule. If you look at a polite letter, if somebody is writing a polite letter and they use specifically reason alone and nothing else, they're not going to know it's a polite letter. What makes a polite letter is the sentiment that is understood by specific social situations. You don't write a letter of, for example, if somebody has passed away and you're going to write a polite letter, you're not going to put in the letter something degrading or something bad about the person who has passed. That comes from the sentiment of understanding but humility. That comes from the understanding of grief, especially in the United States. I mean, stated by Robin Williams, we have a way of immortalizing our dead, because when somebody passes away, we never want to think of the bad things. We only want to think of the good things. That comes from our understanding of sentimental feelings, not from reason. One must almost need to be a master of sentiment in order to write a polite letter. They have to understand all the subtle nuances in the grieving process in order to write a polite letter. And so Hume states, then the artist would be the master when it comes to these types of situations, because the artist possesses the ability of accuracy and knowledge of the internal fabrics and various species of sentiment, which discriminate vice and virtue. If I write a letter and I state, I'm sorry your father passed away, but he was cheating on your mother anyway, that would not be a polite letter. That would be a vice in the polite letter making. So an artist would know and be able to write a beautiful poem that will allow the person to grieve and fill their hearts with joy. And so the artist is the master of these sentimental situations. He does give one other example, which I really like. He talks about the example of somebody painting a portrait of the human body, where the positions of the muscles and the fabrics of the bones are all made with a specific point of accuracy, because accuracy is advantageous to beauty. Where the nose is positioned, where the eyes are positioned, the way the person looks over the shoulder a certain way in the painting. All of these types of accuracies are very advantageous to beauty, because even if the composition or the size is off, it really stands out and it's no longer beautiful. Without proportion, you're not going to get beauty. And he says, accuracy is in every case advantageous to beauty, as just reasoning is to delicate sentiment. You have to have the right amount of reason in delicate sentiment, just as much as you need accuracy in advantageous beauty. Because in vain, we would exalt the one by depreciating the other. If I depreciate the painter's ability to be accurate, you will completely negate the beauty. Just like without just reasoning, you're not going to have delicate sentiment. Especially in the examples of the polite letter and, of course, the artist's rendition. So one's ability to navigate social ideals of being polite or artistic aspects of beauty relies on sentiment. It relies on sentiment and precise reasoning. So that's what abstruse philosophy can do. It can allow you to reason with its subserviency of sentiment, proper social etiquette, correct attitudes of justice. It can allow you to form social contracts in the example of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, because not every man is allowed to enjoy without opposition his own taste and sentiment. Abstruse philosophy has a place in philosophy as long as we realize it does have a subserviency to the easy and humane. And if you're not buying this argument, that's okay, because he really demonstrates later on in the sections where this subserviency specifically comes into play. Just for now, kind of understand, how he's building here and what he's saying. He's saying that in many aspects, our ability to reason, proper etiquette, beauty, and things like that obviously demonstrate a subserviency to the easy and humane, obviously demonstrate a subserviency to the sentiment. And he's going to show or demonstrate more aspects of this later on. But right now, he's just planting the seed. And now we'll go into what the abstract and abstruse cannot do. Now, this slide or this section is going to be kind of short because it's kind of obvious what he's building towards here on what the abstract and abstruse philosophy can't do. And this entire rhetoric is really specifically geared towards Descartes' metaphysics. It starts with, "Here lies the justest and most plausible objection against a considerable part of metaphysics, that they are not properly a science, but arise either from a fruitless efforts of human vanity, which would penetrate into subjects utterly inaccessible to the understanding." He's saying it is our human vanity that makes us believe we can understand the metaphysical concept of God. Because remember, that's the metaphysics in Descartes. We use God or God's ability to not be a deceiver. He's an omnipotent being that would give us the faculties to understand the outside world, which is why we know there is an outside world we can understand. It is our human vanity that allows us to say that we understand a being like this and specifically what they would want to do. And he goes on to state, it arises from the craft of popular superstitions, which being unable to defend themselves on fair ground, raise these intangible bramblings to cover and protect their weaknesses. Descartes brought out the metaphysics of the omnipotent being to cover the weaknesses of the reason's ability to perceive correctly the outside world with certainty. Yet he makes the mistake of reasoning that we can understand at all the power, will, or agenda of an omnipotent being. His argument was going south. His argument of just using reason came into roadblocks because reason alone cannot solidify the understanding of the outside world. We could be dreaming. There could be an evil deceiver, according to Descartes. And with that evil deceiver, there's no way to know if he's deceiving me about the outside world. I could be a brain in a jar being fed sense perception, and there's no way to certainly know otherwise. So these weaknesses are the reason Descartes brought out the metaphysics of the omnipotent and supremely good being that would not deceive us. But he makes a mistake because if there really exists an omnipotent being, how is it I can possibly understand his power, his will, or his agenda? That is my own human vanity that makes me believe I can even comprehend such a powerful force. And so that's what the abstract and abstruse can't do. They can't get into these metaphysical arguments talking about things that they have no idea, or if even did exist, they would not be able to even comprehend. And that's what Hume is saying here. And that's why it's pretty short, because it's fairly obvious where he was going this entire time. Rationalists can't make that leap, especially people in metaphysical sciences or the metaphysical philosophies. They can't make those leaps because the metaphysics deals in a world entirely full of superstitions that even if they existed, we have zero access to. And if we have no access to it, then why are we coming to these conclusions about it at all? Why is it even a topic of conversation if we have zero access to it whatsoever? We have no idea what it is. That is what Hume is saying. And with that, we'll move on to his philosophical project, where he starts focusing entirely on human understanding, or the process of human understanding. Inquiry into human understanding. So after Hume delves into the problems of the abstruse philosophy's capabilities to handle metaphysical questions, as them being just superstitions, abstruse philosophy shouldn't deal with the superstitious. It shouldn't deal with that which is unattainable or unattainable for us. So for Hume, the only method of freeing us from this type of learning, or as he says, from these abstruse questions, is to inquire seriously into the nature of human understanding and show from an exact analysis of its powers and capacity that it is by no means fitted for such a remote and abstruse subjects. So he's going to show that our basis of understanding, the way the human being learns, the way the human being acquires knowledge, will demonstrate that the mind is not fitted to learn from such remote and abstruse subjects. And that's why he starts focusing on human understanding. Another reason is because he has such big admiration for Isaac Newton. As he states in the reading, till a philosopher at last rose, who seems from the happiest reason to have also determined the laws of forces by which the revolutions of the planets are governed and directed. Galileo gave us the heliocentric form of the universe, where the planets revolve around the sun. But it wasn't until Isaac Newton that we discovered the force by which everything revolves. And this is what Hume wants to do for philosophy. As he states, there is no reason to despair of equal success in our inquiries concerning the mental powers and economy, if prosecuted with equal capacity and caution. If he does the same thing Newton did, and he tries to figure out how human beings seek to understand things, then he can go into epistemology, or how knowledge is acquired. You see the big difference here between Hume and Descartes and Plato? I mean, Descartes put all of his beliefs under a skeptical microscope and then threw away everything he could doubt. Plato sought out knowledge by argumentation, by seeking out human understanding in the form of arguing what we already possess. One believes they possess this power of wisdom, then he asks questions in order to ascertain the truth. But Hume is like, wait a minute here. You guys are taking a big leap here, because you're already inquiring to subjects. You're already trying to gain knowledge of subjects. We need to focus on human understanding, how the human being learns, the nature of learning from the resources a human being has. If my resources are limited to the point where no matter what I try to do, my mental capacities could never comprehend the metaphysical, then we need to focus our attention to that which we can learn. Just like Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton saw that the planets were revolving around the sun, or he believed in the heliocentric theory that the planets revolve around the sun, but nobody knew why. And until Isaac Newton, they had no idea of the theory of gravity, the force by which determined the planetary movements. So that is why Hume starts focusing on the inquiry of human understanding. That's why he focuses on human understanding, because he believes we take things for granted when we start focusing on subjects. We need to focus on how the human being learns. And once we understand how the human being learns, then we can delve into what can be learned. It's like trying to run before you can walk. It's you trying to have a perfect sentence before you've learned any words. It shouldn't be done. This is how we err. So Hume believes our explanations of human understanding and behavior are in the state similar to that of pre-Newton astronomy. Hume wants to delve into how we reason, and he wants to delve into the principles that underlie our thought and reasoning. Hume admits that abstruse philosophy has a place, and he brings this up when he talks about moralists. He says moralists, and he means the ethics portion of philosophy. He states moralists' passion, searching for one great principle. They are excusable in expecting to find some general principle on which vices and virtues were justly to be resolved. For example, we have an idea of vice and virtue when it comes to the innocent. The slaughtering of innocents is universally seen as a vice. And to protect the innocent is universally seen as a virtue. So we have succeeded, especially in morals or ethics, in finding the underlying principles. It has been fruitful for us. I can already hear the relativist, and the relativist is those who do not believe in a universal right and wrong, shouting from the rooftop. But, there are some tribes in Indonesia that do not believe in innocence, or that innocence itself is just a point of view. To that I say that most infants are considered innocent. And while we may say that some people do not care about innocence, I give you this example. Say you have a beaver. Okay, and a beaver's innate passion is to build dams. I mean, it's innate to their hardwiring. But if you take a beaver out of the lake, out of the water, where it has no access to sticks or anything, it's not going to build the dam. But that doesn't mean beavers aren't dam builders. Just because you can show some instances where some people don't care about innocent life, that doesn't mean that inherently people in general don't care about innocent life. And if you like the dam and dam builder, that comes from Confucian Eastern philosophy, where you get a lot of moral ethics, universal moral ethics. But anyway, I digress. Philosophy, according to Hume, errs when it seeks to separate itself from the sentiment. As he's brought up before, and he's demonstrated with the artist and the polite letters, abstruse philosophy has a subservience to the sentimental. And Hume is going to demonstrate this subservience by demonstrating how human beings understand, or the nature of human understanding. He's going to demonstrate this subservience in our fundamental understanding with his arguments, so that rationalists take things for granted when they believe they can use pure reason. That's that dogmatic slumber that Immanuel Kant was talking about earlier. You know, he had a dogmatic slumber because he took things for granted in the scope of rationalism. Because Hume succeeds in demonstrating that in our fundamental understanding, the way human beings understand, sentiment is an obvious subservient to the abstruse philosophy. And once we can understand how a human being naturally understands, then we can form conclusions on how best to ascertain knowledge through this nature of understanding. So Hume's philosophical project, if you will, is to start focusing on the nature of human understanding, because once we understand how a human being learns fundamentally, we can reach conclusions on that which he can learn, how he is limited. When we know the limitations of reason, we know the scope of philosophy that we should focus on. If metaphysics is unattainable by human reason, then we should start throwing out metaphysics and start focusing on something else. If human understanding is, or abstruse philosophy is subservient to sentiment, then we ought to only come to conclusions that use sentiment, and use sentiment with just reason. Can't have one without the other. Now, don't worry if the idea of sentimental subservience at this point doesn't make sense to you. That's okay. We haven't learned any of his philosophical arguments yet. He has demonstrated, at least to some degree, that understanding or reasoning, for example, with polite letters, does have a subservience to sentiment. Because if you don't have that sentimental sensitivity, you are not going to be able to write a polite letter. It's just going to be ramblings, unless you get lucky. But, we're not talking about luck here. So don't worry if you don't understand the subservience yet. That will definitely come later. I'm not going to be testing you right now, or it's not going to be on the quiz right now, how he argues subservience. What we need to take from this first part is why he directs his study towards human understanding. And he directs his study towards human understanding because he believes philosophy up to now has taken sentiment for granted. They believe that they can rationalize without sentiment. And so he's going to inquire to the nature of human understanding to demonstrate how human understanding's limitations force us to use sentiment in our reasoning. That is his philosophical project. That is his goal in the inquiry of human understanding, to demonstrate how human understanding at a fundamental level already includes sentiment. You guys have a great week. As usual, do the quiz. Post a discussion. Please try to post discussions before Thursday. That way you give the rest of the class a good amount of discussion posts to choose from to reply. That way it boosts the probability of having good, strong, engaging conversations. Have a great week. Take care.